The scent of lavender and old books. That was the smell of my grandmother Rose's house, a fragrance that had cradled me since childhood. Her home was my sanctuary, a place where the world's sharp edges seemed to soften. Grandma Rose was the keeper of our family's stories, her memory a vast library of anecdotes and quiet wisdom. She taught me how to bake apple pie, how to identify the constellations on a clear summer night, and most importantly, how to listen, not just with my ears, but with my heart. Her hands, though gnarled with age, were always gentle, her touch a silent reassurance of a love that asked for nothing in return. But time, the relentless thief, had begun to steal from her. It started subtly. A forgotten name here, a repeated story there. We dismissed it as simple old age, the forgivable lapses of a mind that had lived for over 8 decades. My Aunt Susan, her only daughter, would wave it off with a sigh. Mom's just getting older, Amelia. It happens. Susan was a practical woman, always had been. While I saw poetry in Grandma Rose's rambling tales, Susan saw only inconvenience. She lived just a town over, a 40-minute drive. Yet her visits grew less frequent as Grandma's needs grew more pronounced. I was the one who found her after she'd had her first serious fall. I had dropped by with groceries, my key turning in the lock to a silence that felt wrong, heavy. I found her on the floor in the kitchen, a spilled glass of water shimmering beside her like a pool of fallen stars. She was conscious, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "I was just trying to get some water, dear," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. The doctor at the hospital called it a mild stroke. The words were clinical, cold, but they landed on me with the force of a physical blow. It was a turning point, the moment we could no longer pretend that everything was fine. The responsibility for her care fell, as if by unspoken decree, almost entirely on Susan's shoulders. She was the daughter, after all. She moved Grandma Rose into a spare room in her house, a room that felt sterile and impersonal compared to the warm clutter of her own home. Susan's husband was distant, her children grown and gone. The house was quiet, and soon it became tense. Every phone call I had with Susan was strained, her voice tight with a simmering resentment that she never quite named, but that I could feel crackling over the line. "She kept me up all night again," she'd say, her words clipped. "She thought it was 1965 and was looking for your grandfather." Or, "She refused to eat her dinner, said I was trying to poison her." Can you believe that, Amelia? My heart ached for both of them. For my grandmother, lost in the fog of her own mind, and for my aunt, buckling under a weight she had never expected to carry alone. I tried to help. I drove down every weekend, spending Saturdays and Sundays with Grandma Rose. I'd bring old photo albums, and we'd sit together, her finger tracing the faces of people she sometimes remembered. I'd read to her, paint her nails, or just sit with her in the garden, watching the birds. During those hours, glimpses of the grandmother I knew would surface. A witty comment, a flash of recognition in her eyes, a warm squeeze of my hand. Those moments were my fuel. But my presence seemed to only irritate Susan more. She saw my visits not as help, but as a judgment on her own shortcomings. She would find fault in everything I did. "Don't give her that much sugar, it's bad for her. You're getting her all worked up. It'll take me hours to calm her down after you leave." It felt like I was walking on eggshells, my every move scrutinized. The breaking point came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Susan called me at work, her voice frantic. "I can't do this anymore, Amelia. I just can't." She tried to leave the house again. She said she needed to go to the market to buy bread for your mother's lunch. Your mother, Amelia. My mother, who's been gone for 20 years. "I'll come right now," I said, my heart pounding. "I can be there in a couple of hours. Maybe we can talk about getting some professional help, a daytime nurse, or—" "I don't need you to come and play the hero," she snapped. The venom in her voice stunned me into silence. "I've been dealing with this day in and day out while you just swoop in for a few hours on the weekend to play happy families. That's not fair, Susan," I said, my own voice trembling. "I'm trying to help. I want to help more. We're in this together." And that's when she said the words that would change everything. Words that were as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "No, we are not in this together," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling hiss. "You want to help? Fine. Come and get her. She's your burden now." The line went dead, but her words hung in the air, echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. Burden. That's what my grandmother had become to her own daughter. Not a person, not a mother, but a weight to be discarded. For a long moment, I just stood in my office, the dead phone pressed to my ear. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to amplify the ringing in my ears. Burden. The word was a stone, and Susan had thrown it with perfect, cruel aim. It sank deep, not just into my heart, but into my gut, leaving a cold, heavy sickness. My initial shock quickly curdled into a hot, protective anger. How could she? How could she speak of the woman who had raised her, who had loved her, with such dismissive cruelty? My hands were shaking as I packed my laptop and told my boss I had a family emergency. He nodded with sympathetic eyes, no questions asked. The drive to Susan's house was a blur of highway and a storm of thoughts. I replayed years of conversations in my head, searching for the moment the crack in our family had started to form. Susan and I were never close, separated by a 10-year age gap and fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. I was the dreamer. She was the pragmatist. But we were family. I thought that meant something. I thought it meant you weathered storms together, that you held on to each other when the world tried to pull you apart. Clearly, Susan disagreed. I felt a surge of fear, a cold wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm me. What was I doing? I lived in a one-bedroom apartment. I had a demanding job. How was I going to care for my grandmother? The practicalities of the situation were a tangled knot in my mind. But then, an image of Grandma Rose's face floated into my consciousness. Her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she told a story. And I knew, with a certainty that silenced all the fear, that I was doing the only thing I could. Love, true love, wasn't about convenience. It was about showing up. When I pulled into Susan's driveway, the house looked unnervingly normal. Manicured lawn, a cheerful wreath on the door. It was a perfect facade. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment, Susan opened it. She looked terrible. Her eyes were puffy and red-rimmed, her skin sallow. She wore a stained sweatshirt and her hair was a mess. She looked not like a monster, but like a soldier who had just surrendered after a long losing battle. "You came," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "You told me to," I replied, my voice equally quiet but firm. I stepped inside. The house was immaculate, but it felt airless, sterile. From the living room, I could hear the television murmuring. "She's in there," Susan said, gesturing vaguely. "She's calm now, watching her shows." She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at a spot on the wall behind me. I walked into the living room. Grandma Rose was sitting on the sofa, a knitted blanket pooled around her waist. She was watching a game show, her expression placid. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, swallowed by the plush beige couch. She glanced up as I entered, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Amelia, dear, did you bring the cinnamon buns?" she asked, her voice hopeful. For a moment, she was back with me, remembering the treats I used to bring on Saturdays. My throat tightened. "Not today, Grandma. We're going to go on a little trip. Just you and me." "A trip? Oh, how lovely." I turned back to Susan, who had remained in the hallway, a sentinel guarding a home she no longer wanted. "I'm going to pack a bag for her. Her things are in the guest room. Down the hall," Susan said. She still hadn't moved. "I packed a few things this afternoon. Her medications are in the blue bag on the dresser." The premeditation of it all, the cold efficiency of her packing a few things, sent another shard of ice through my heart. I went to the guest room. It was as impersonal as a hotel room. A suitcase was open on the neatly made bed, a few sets of clothes folded inside. It wasn't enough. I opened the closet and the dresser drawers and began pulling out more of her things. Her favorite soft cardigan, the worn copy of Pride and Prejudice she'd had for 50 years, the framed photo of my grandfather that always sat on her bedside table. I packed not just for her body, but for her soul. I packed the remnants of her life, the pieces of her that Susan had overlooked. When I was done, I zipped the suitcase and carried it into the living room. Susan was there now, standing stiffly by the armchair. "I can't do it," she whispered, as if confessing a terrible sin. "I know you hate me. I hate myself, but I can't. Every day, a piece of me dies." She looks at me, and her eyes are vacant. She doesn't know who I am. And the things she says, it's like living with a ghost who accuses you of things you've never done. Her voice broke, and a single tear traced a path through her exhausted face. I looked at my aunt, and the anger I had been clinging to began to dissipate, replaced by a profound and weary sadness. She wasn't a monster. She was just a woman who had broken. Perhaps I would have broken too. "I don't hate you, Susan," I said, and it was the truth. "I'm just so sorry for everything." I helped Grandma Rose to her feet, my arms securely around her waist. She was frail, her bones like a bird's. "Where are we going, dear?" she asked again, looking from my face to Susan's. She sensed the tension, the thick, unspoken grief that filled the room. "We're going home, Grandma," I said softly. I walked her slowly out of the house, out of the life she had briefly shared with her daughter. I didn't look back at Susan, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a solitary figure in her own private tragedy. As I buckled my grandmother into the passenger seat, she reached out and patted my hand. "You're a good girl, Amelia," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "Your mother always said you were the one with the biggest heart." And as I drove away, leaving my aunt and her silent, sterile house behind, I clung to those words. The road ahead was unknown, a landscape of challenges I couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in a long time, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The transition from Susan's spacious, silent house to my cozy, cluttered apartment was a study in contrasts. My one-bedroom apartment, which had always felt like the perfect size for me, suddenly seemed impossibly small. It was filled with the evidence of my life: stacks of books, a half-finished painting on an easel in the corner, and the lingering scent of coffee and turpentine. It was a space that was entirely mine, and now I had to make it ours. The first night was brutal. I set up Grandma Rose in my bedroom, taking the lumpy sofa bed for myself. I thought she had settled down, but every hour she would wake up, disoriented. "Henry?" she'd call out, her voice thin and reedy in the darkness, searching for my grandfather who had passed away a decade ago. "Henry, is that you?" Each time I would go to her, my heart aching, and sit by her bed, holding her hand until her breathing evened out and she drifted back to a restless sleep. "It's Amelia, Grandma. You're safe. I'm here." The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, my body stiff and my head foggy with exhaustion. The reality of my decision had arrived, sitting like an unwelcome guest at my breakfast table. I had to call my boss and explain that I needed to work from home for the foreseeable future. I was a graphic designer, and while my company was flexible, my explanation was vague and I could feel my boss's patience was not infinite. "Just try to stay on top of the Sterling project, Amelia. The deadline is firm." Juggling my work while caring for Grandma Rose was a chaotic dance. I would be deep in concentration, designing a logo or laying out a web page, only to be pulled away by a sudden cry from the other room. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find her trying to light a dish towel on the electric stove, convinced she needed to heat the kettle for tea. I gently took the towel from her, my heart hammering against my ribs, and guided her back to the living room, a torrent of what-ifs flooding my mind. My apartment was a minefield of potential dangers I had never considered. I spent that evening hiding knives, putting safety locks on cabinets, and unplugging appliances. I felt less like a granddaughter and more like a warden. There were moments of despair, moments when I would lock myself in the bathroom and let the tears come, my shoulders shaking with the silent sobs of feeling utterly overwhelmed. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger with dark circles under her eyes, her face etched with a constant, low-grade anxiety. I felt a pang of understanding for Susan. I understood the suffocating weight, the feeling of being slowly erased by the needs of another. The thought was a betrayal, and I pushed it down, ashamed. But then, amid the chaos and the exhaustion, there were moments of pure, unadulterated grace. They were small, fleeting, but they were everything. We fell into a new kind of routine. In the mornings, I'd put on her favorite old records, Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, and we'd have breakfast together on the little balcony, watching the city wake up. She loved the feeling of the sun on her face. During the day, while I worked at the dining table, she would sit on the sofa, sometimes knitting tangled messes of yarn, sometimes just staring out the window, lost in her own world. But she was calm. She was peaceful. The frantic, hunted look she'd had at Susan's house was gone. One afternoon, she shuffled over to my desk and placed a trembling hand on my shoulder. I was struggling with a design, the deadline looming, and my frustration was mounting. I was about to tell her I needed to focus, but I stopped. She was pointing at my screen. "That color," she said, her voice surprisingly lucid. "It needs more warmth, like a sunset just before it disappears." I looked at the screen, at the cool blues and grays I had been working with. On impulse, I clicked open the color palette and added a deep, warm coral, just a touch of it in the corner of the design. And she was right. It instantly brought the entire image to life, giving it the emotional depth it had been missing. "How did you know, Grandma?" I asked, turning to her in astonishment. She smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "I spent my whole life looking at sunsets, dear. You learn a thing or two." She patted my shoulder again and shuffled back to the sofa. In that moment, she wasn't just a patient to be cared for. She was my grandmother, the woman of quiet wisdom, still there, beneath the fog. I began to see her not as a collection of symptoms and needs, but as Rose. We developed our own language, a mix of half-finished sentences and shared memories. I started bringing the garden to her, filling the apartment with potted plants, lavender, rosemary, and geraniums, so the scent of her old home was always with us. I read her the poetry she'd always loved, and sometimes she would recite a line or two along with me, the words a muscle memory from a time when her mind was her own. One evening, I was feeling particularly low. A project I had worked on for weeks had been rejected by the client, and the feedback was harsh. I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the sofa, feeling the sting of failure. Grandma Rose, who had been quiet all evening, reached over and began to stroke my hair, her touch as light as a moth's wing. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, her gnarled fingers running through my hair, a silent, steady comfort. It was a simple gesture, but it undid me. The tears I'd been holding back began to fall. They weren't tears of despair this time, but tears of gratitude. In that small, quiet living room with the city lights twinkling outside, I was no longer a caregiver and she was no longer a burden. We were just two women, a grandmother and a granddaughter, bound by a love that was stronger than time, stronger than memory, stronger than the fear that had once threatened to break us all. I had taken her in to save her, but in the quiet moments, in the scent of lavender and the touch of a gentle hand, I was beginning to realize that maybe she was saving me too. The next few months were a tapestry woven with threads of challenge and unexpected joy. I found a rhythm I never thought possible. I hired a home health aide, a kind, sturdy woman named Clara, who came for a few hours 3 times a week. Her presence was a lifeline, giving me pockets of time to focus solely on work, run errands, or simply sit in a coffee shop for an hour and feel like myself again. My company, seeing my dedication and the quality of my work, agreed to make my remote status permanent. A quiet, profound gratitude settled in my heart for the life we were building. Our little apartment, once a bachelor pad, had transformed into a haven. The scent of lavender was a constant, and the balcony garden thrived under Grandma Rose's watchful, if sometimes vacant, gaze. She had good days and bad days. On the good days, she was sharp and funny, her old self shining through the clouds. We'd do crosswords. She'd beat me at gin rummy, and she'd tell me stories about her childhood with a clarity that was breathtaking. On the bad days, she was lost, calling for her sister who had died in childhood, or staring at her own reflection in the mirror and asking who the old woman was. I learned to navigate these tides, to celebrate the moments of lucidity, and to offer quiet comfort during the storms. I learned that love isn't about fixing things. It's about being the anchor. The call came on a Tuesday, the same day of the week that Susan had cast her mother out. It felt like a cruel irony. I was on a video conference when I heard a crash from the living room. I excused myself and ran, my heart seizing with dread. I found Grandma Rose on the floor, her breathing shallow, her face pale. She had suffered another stroke, a much more severe one this time. In the sterile, beeping world of the hospital emergency room, I felt a terrifying sense of isolation. The doctor spoke in grave, gentle tones about palliative care and making her comfortable. I sat by her bed, holding her still, cool hand, watching the rise and fall of her chest. She was unresponsive. For the first time, I felt the true weight of my decision, the terrifying finality of it all. And in that moment of pure, undiluted fear, I did the one thing I thought I would never do. I called Susan. She answered on the second ring. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "We're at City General." "It's bad, Susan. It's really bad." I expected hesitation, excuses. Instead, all she said was, "I'm on my way." She arrived less than an hour later. She looked different. Her hair was cut stylishly, and she wore a soft blue sweater that brought out the color in her eyes. The frantic, brittle energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber composure. She walked over to the bed and looked down at her mother, her face crumbling. "Oh, Mama," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She reached out and touched Grandma Rose's hair, her gesture hesitant, full of a painful, belated tenderness. We sat together in the vinyl chairs, the silence between us no longer thick with anger, but heavy with shared grief. "I'm so sorry, Amelia," she said finally, her voice thick. "For everything. There's no excuse for how I acted. I was drowning, and I tried to pull you under with me." She told me she had started seeing a therapist a few weeks after I took Grandma Rose. She'd been forced to confront the ugliness of her own burnout, the resentment that had poisoned her. "I was so jealous of you," she confessed, looking at her hands. "She would light up when you came to visit. With me, she was just angry, confused. It felt like she was punishing me, and I couldn't see that it was just the disease. I couldn't separate the mother I had lost from the patient she had become." "You could. You saw her. I only saw the burden." The word hung in the air again, but this time it had lost its power to wound. It was just a sad, honest confession. "I was drowning too at first," I admitted. "There were days I didn't think I could do it. We talked for hours. We talked about our childhoods, about our mother, about the woman lying in the bed a few feet away who had shaped both of our lives in such different ways." For the first time, I saw Susan not as my antagonist, but as a woman who had loved her mother so much that she couldn't bear to watch her disappear. Her way of coping was to push it all away. Mine was to pull it closer. Grandma Rose stabilized over the next few days, though the doctors were clear she would never be the same. She was weaker, more fragile. The stroke had stolen more of her memories, more of her words. The discussion of a long-term care facility came up again, this time with a gentle finality from the medical staff. I was steeling myself for the argument, preparing to fight to bring her home, when Susan spoke. "No," she said firmly, looking at the doctor. "She's not going to a facility. She's going home with Amelia." She then turned to me. "I can't do what you do, Amelia. I don't have that kind of strength. But I can help. I want to help." And she did. She set up a fund to pay for a full-time live-in caregiver, a wonderful woman who would become my partner in this journey. Susan started visiting every weekend, not out of obligation, but with a genuine desire to connect. Her visits were quiet. She would sit with her mother, reading to her or simply holding her hand. Sometimes Grandma Rose would look at her, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, and say, "Susan, you came." And the look on my aunt's face in those moments was one of pure, unadulterated grace. We brought Grandma Rose home. The apartment felt different now, imbued with a sacred quiet. She spent most of her days in a comfortable reclining chair by the window, watching the world go by. Her journey was nearing its end, we knew that. But there was no longer any tragedy in our little home. There was just love. One evening, about a month later, Susan and I were sitting with her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the exact shades of deep, warm coral that Grandma Rose had once pointed out on my computer screen. A Sinatra song was playing softly on the stereo. She had been silent all day, but as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, she turned her head slightly and looked at us. A faint smile touched her lips. Her eyes, for a moment, were clear and bright. "My girls," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. She reached out, and Susan and I each took one of her hands. We sat there, the three of us, her hands in ours, bound together by the enduring, complicated, and unconditional love that had finally, in the twilight of her life, brought us all home. The 1-year anniversary of Grandma Rose's passing fell on a Sunday, a day crisp with the promise of autumn. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind of sky she had loved. I had suggested to Susan that we spend the day together, not in mourning, but in celebration of a life that had so profoundly shaped our own. She agreed without hesitation. I still lived in the same apartment. After Grandma Rose was gone, the silence was deafening. The scent of lavender faded, and for weeks the space felt hollow, like a shell washed up on the shore. But slowly, I began to reclaim it. I moved my easel back to its spot by the window, the canvas no longer blank, but filled with vibrant, sun-drenched landscapes, inspired by the balcony garden that I still meticulously tended. The apartment was no longer a makeshift hospice. It was my home again, but a home fundamentally changed, its walls saturated with the memories of our last year together. It was a space that had expanded my heart. Susan and I decided to drive out to the coast, to a small, windswept beach Grandma Rose had loved as a child. It was a place she had described to me during one of her lucid afternoons, her eyes distant and soft with memory. "The wind there," she'd said. "It smells of salt and freedom." Susan drove. Her car, once a symbol of her sterile and ordered life, now felt like a comfortable space. We talked easily, the conversation flowing without the strain or guardedness that had defined our relationship for so long. She told me about her recent trip with her husband, a second honeymoon of sorts to Italy. "We actually talked," she said, a small, amazed smile on her face. "Not just about bills and logistics, but about us, about the future." The therapy, she said, had unearthed so much, not just about her grief for her mother, but about the ways she had walled herself off from everyone she loved, including herself. When we arrived, the beach was nearly deserted. We took off our shoes and walked along the shoreline, the cold sand a shock to the system. The wind was exactly as Grandma Rose had described it, whipping our hair around our faces, carrying the clean, sharp scent of the sea. "I brought something," Susan said, pulling a small, worn book from her bag. It was her mother's copy of Pride and Prejudice. She opened it, and a dried, pressed flower, a pansy, fell from between the pages. "I gave this to her when I was 10, Susan said, her voice thick with emotion as she picked up the delicate flower. "I'd picked it from our garden. She told me she would keep it forever. I can't believe she did." We found a piece of driftwood to sit on, the pale sun warming our faces. Susan began to read aloud, her voice clear and steady against the rhythmic crash of the waves. She read the scene where Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, finally, haltingly, confessed their love for one another. It was a passage Grandma Rose had adored, one she could recite by heart. As I listened, I looked at my aunt. I saw not the brittle, resentful woman who had hurled her mother's care at me like a weapon, but a woman who was slowly, bravely finding her way back to herself. The anger I had once felt was a distant ghost, replaced by a quiet, steady affection. The crucible of that last year had burned away all the pretense, all the old hurts and misunderstandings, leaving only what was real. It had forged a bond between us, a sisterhood I never knew I was missing. "You know," I said, when she had finished reading and closed the book, "I think in the end, we gave her what she needed." Susan nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "You did, Amelia. You gave her a home. You gave her peace." "You did too, Susan," I said softly. "You gave her a daughter again. You came back. That mattered. It mattered to her, and it mattered to me." A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, but she was smiling. "She was so much more than a burden," she whispered, the word now a quiet acknowledgement of a past self. "She was a lesson." We sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the gulls dive and soar. The grief was still there, a gentle ache in the center of my chest, but it was no longer a raw wound. It had become a part of me, a reminder of the depth of love I was capable of. The experience had reshaped me. My art had a newfound depth, my friendships were richer, and my capacity for empathy, I realized, was boundless. I had learned to find grace in the chaos, to be an anchor in the storm. When it was time to leave, we walked back to the car, our shoulders occasionally brushing. It was a simple, unconscious gesture of companionship, of family. "What will you do now, Amelia?" Susan asked as she started the engine. I thought for a moment, picturing my sunlit apartment, my thriving plants, the half-finished canvas waiting for me. I thought of the quiet strength I had discovered within myself. "I'm going to paint," I said, "and I'm going to live. Really, truly live, with a big heart, just like she taught me." Susan reached over and squeezed my hand. Her touch was warm, her grip firm. It was a silent reassurance of a love that had not only endured, but had been reborn, stronger and more true, from the ashes of loss. We were Rose's girls, and we had at last found our way.